Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Ad Fontes Media's Teaching News Literacy in the era of hyper-polarized media. My name is Jennifer Furlong, and I'm the Director of Communications and an Analyst Manager at Ad Fontes. And joining me this evening, we have Beth Heldebrandt, who is our Media Research Specialist, and we have Aaron Fox Ramirez, who is our Director of Research and Ratings. Just like with the very first webinar, they're going to help answer questions when we get to the end of the presentation. And they're also going to help highlight some of the more important elements that we want to discuss tonight. So glad to see that you came back for session 2. For those of you who are just now joining us, welcome. Last week in the first session, what we covered, we did an introduction to Ad Fontes, and we talked about what is our why. And we talked about the tools that the analysts use in order to analyze all of the content pieces that we look at to put them on the media bias chart. And we started the conversation on our methodology. We use content analysis, and we primarily focused on reliability. So that was the axis that we spent the vast majority of our time looking at, and what were the different elements that we use in order to determine whether or not we think a particular article or a podcast episode or a television episode, whether or not we think that they are reliable. So for this evening, we're going to shift our focus to how do we use our methodology to analyze for bias. And I'm going to break that down for you as well, the different elements that we look at in order to arrive at our decisions, what our assessment is. And then we also have some examples that we're going to show you. We're going to sprinkle them throughout the presentation so you can see what we're talking about in terms of the language, political terminology, all of these different elements that go into how to analyze for bias. Of course, next week is going to be our final session. But if you have any teacher friends who were interested in this, and they, for some reason, didn't register, please encourage them to go ahead and register. It's not too late. If anything, if they can make it to the last one, that's fantastic. And even if they can't make it to the last one, everybody will get a copy of the recordings. So if they're interested, at least they can get a copy of the recording. So please encourage them to join us next week, or at least register so they can get the recordings. And so next week, what we'll do is we'll do the recap. We'll talk about implementation, how you can implement it into your different courses that you teach, and how to request a certificate so that you can turn that in for CEUs if you're eligible for that. And then we'll finish everything up, wrap it up with the Q&A. So anything that we're not able to get to this evening as far as questions, I want to continue to encourage you to ask your questions. That way we can get to them at the end of the presentation. And in between the webinars, if any questions come up, please email those to us so that we can implement them into our final session together. We want to make sure that we have all of the information that you need in order to implement news literacy education into your curricula. So let's turn our focus to bias. One of the things that is really important when we look at bias for all of the content pieces, when we're measuring bias, we need to recognize that bias in itself is not inherently bad. It's okay to have some bias. As a matter of fact, all of us have some bias. We are human. So there's nothing inherently wrong with having a conservative point of view or a centrist point of view or a liberal point of view. You know, all of those points of view will stem from principles that connect to our moral foundations. And so when we begin to see disagreements, usually it's based on how our moral foundations are informing our actions, or how they are impacting our policy positions. So that's when we'll begin to see that, we're not going to see eye to eye when it comes to the actions and the policy positions, but that is okay. We actually need these different points of view, especially in a democratic society, because we have to debate the merits of all of these different positions. And this is how we solve problems in our society. We don't want to fall into groupthink. That's why it's not inherently bad to have a different point of view, to have a bias. So the different points of view are incredibly valuable, and they are critical. Because debates, they are the fundamental basis for how we progress as a society. So the debates that, they do involve left bias, right bias, center bias. But just because when you begin reading an article, if you do find that there is some bias in that article, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically unreliable or that it's automatically misleading. Just because you might disagree with the opinion that's in it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically unreliable. So that is an important distinction that we want to make, especially when it concerns to analyzing the text for bias. We depend on the methodology. And remember, we're talking about the content analysis methodology that we discussed in session 1. It's critical that we use that methodology because it's a way that we can ensure that all of the analysts, and in your case, all of your students, as well as any of your fellow teachers who want to adopt this in their classrooms, we want to make sure that all of us are assessing the articles in a consistent way. So we want to make sure that we're applying the content analysis consistently. But that doesn't mean just because we are using the methodology and that we're trying to remain consistent in the application of that methodology, it doesn't mean that we don't have our own opinions. We don't have our own bias. This is how we try to mitigate our bias when we're analyzing these different articles. So one of the things that happens with us as analysts when we work together in our shifts is that we at times will have to remind ourselves that, it's not our job when we're looking at the text. It's not our job as analysts to advocate for a certain position. It's crucial that we approach each piece of content separately, as objectively, and to mitigate that bias. We want to be as unbiased and objective as possible. So remind your students of that. Consistently have that a part of the conversation, that we don't want to get into the position of we're going to advocate for what the article is talking about. We want to begin to argue for or against whatever the topic is that the article is covering. Our job is to look at the text and then, using the methodology, analyze the text and come to a conclusion about whether or not we think it's biased. So that's really the value in doing this in a group, especially for us analysts, because we always have a left lean, a right lean, and someone who is in the center, because that does help mitigate our bias. So encourage your students to remain open-minded, and help them to understand throughout these different conversations, the discussions that you can have with them regarding these different sources that you can look at with them, that different points of view are okay and they're absolutely necessary in a democratic society. And those different points of view really should not be viewed automatically as wrong. They're just different. Now, We do know you're familiar with the media bias chart. So you can tell when you look at the chart, one of the things that I've noticed as we continue to increase the number of sources that we have on our chart, it's becoming clearer and clearer that the area that is in the middle right here, we consider this to be either unbiased or maybe it's balanced in its bias. Maybe it's representing alternate points of view. It does have a fair amount of variation in the reliability. So you can see anything that's in the middle here, there are some sources that we'll consider, they're the variety in reliability, or they are just unreliable and maybe even going toward misleading. So I think it's important to note that, because even though we do see, when you look at the chart, that there is a correlation between reliability and bias, at least according to our data, they don't always coincide with one another. So that's a very important distinction to make, a very important conversation to have with your students in the classroom. There is such a thing as a center bias. That's also something important to remember. A lot of times we want to focus on, does this have, especially when we're talking about political leanings, does this lean to the left? Does this lean to the right? But if there is a preference for values or options that are in the middle, like that's the goal, we got to be in the middle. Even when we're given a range of alternatives, that is a bias preference toward the center, toward the middle. And this is important to note as well, because center bias, it can influence decision-making. It can influence our conclusions, the judgments that we make. It can impact how we perceive the information that we're taking in. And so, there can be a center bias, just like there is a left-leaning bias and a right-leaning bias. And sometimes it can result because there is this desire for balance, or there's this desire to avoid what they perceive to be the extreme, positions. Sometimes there could be a bias to the middle because it's due to a lack of knowledge, or maybe the person has a lack of confidence in what they know about the topic, so they don't want to make an extreme judgment about it. And some people will just tend to gravitate toward the middle ground. That's where they want to be. So again, it is important to be aware of center bias, because it can potentially impact the accuracy of the information that you're looking at. It can impact the reliability of the data, as you can see here in the example on the chart. So being aware of the bias and having the methodology that we use to identify that bias, it's important for anyone who is interested in news literacy to be mindful of how to apply this methodology, because it does help mitigate the effects of bias. It helps us strive for a more objective and accurate analysis. And before we move on, I do want to take a moment to brag about the media bias chart. As you can tell, we have a lot of sources on there. We have about 70 analysts now who are working every day of the week, from morning into the evening, to turn different content pieces around. Again, whether it's articles or podcast episodes or television shows. And these analysts represent the political spectrum. And they come together to put this chart together. They're really, truly who they're making this happen. And as a result of all of these analysts coming together, we now have over 3,000 sources that are on our chart. That's a lot of sources. As a matter of fact, that equals to more than 62,000 pieces of content that we have on the chart. So if you are curious about looking it up, we're pretty certain that it is probably on our chart. So that's why we encourage you to familiarize yourself with the interactive media bias chart that we have on our website, so that you can look for whatever your favorite sources are, and be able to bring that into the classroom to have those conversations. And you're going to be able to see later on. So this snapshot right here just shows the actual sources themselves. But when we look at the more granular level, you'll be able to see the individual content pieces that we look at in order to arrive at the overall score of the source on the chart. So we'll dive into that a little bit later on, as we look at some of the specific examples that we've prepared for you this evening. So let's focus our attention on the lower end of the reliability scale, because I did just mention that we do see that there is a correlation between bias and reliability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always that way. So unfortunately, though, when you look at what's considered hyperpartisan and most extreme, so again, look up here at the axis, most extreme left, hyperpartisan left, strong left, skews left, and then we have middle, skews right, strong right, hyperpartisan right, and then most extreme right. So unfortunately, most of the content that falls under the broad umbrella term of misinformation, you'll see that they do tend to be the more extreme type of bias. Now, let me stop here for just a second, and I want to address the term misinformation. You'll notice that on our chart, let's look at the reliability axis right here. You'll notice on our chart, we do not have the word misinformation as a label on the chart. And that's because we recognize that that word is often used to describe information that people just don't agree with. It's not even necessarily something that is false or inaccurate. It is being used in ways just to say, oh, I don't agree with that, so I'm going to call that misinformation. And it has been politicized as a result. And it's important to note that just because something is an opinion doesn't necessarily mean that it's unreliable. Again, so that's an important distinction to make as we begin to really pick apart the bias aspect versus the reliability aspect. So yeah, just because it's an opinion, that does not mean that it's misinformation. So we do believe that it is important to have clarity in the language that you use when discussing words like misinformation with your students. So we like to encourage you to use the language that exists on the chart to get the students really focused on specificity in language. That's critically important so that everybody has the similar understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So we use language like it's inaccurate, information, or it is misleading information, or if there is something that is selective, like maybe the examples that are being used, or the data that's being used, the statistics that's being used, maybe they are selective, or maybe they're incomplete. Maybe it's prone to hyperbole, and so it's more propagandistic. And so that's why have a conversation about these terms so that everybody is clear, the specificity of language, so that we have clarity in exactly what it is that we're talking about. So if you do want to use the term misinformation, just make sure that you're explaining it in a way that it's not the opinion aspect of it, this misinformation, anything that would fall below what we have rated as a 24 below this line. And if you'll remember from last week, we talked about a scale on 1 to 5 on that reliability scale. So this would fall under 5. If it falls within that 5 area, try to use the language here. Have the students explain using concrete examples, using this language. What are the examples that they can draw from the text that they can justify rating a particular source in the way that they did, especially for reliability. And in turn, that is also something that we encourage you to have them do when they're talking about bias. So language is incredibly important as we go through this methodology. Most of the information here that I'm talking about with these examples, they do fall below that 24 line. And usually what's happening when they do fall below the 24 line, it's most of the time it's either because it's about a political topic. So it's one of those hot button issues. It's very emotionally intense, has a lot of emotional appeal in those articles. And you can tell that these particular articles, they are directed at a more political type of audience. So, there is a reason for addressing it the way they're addressing it, for using the language that they're choosing to use, because it is being addressed to a particular political audience, whether it's going to be from the left to the far left or from the right to the far right. So let's continue taking a look at this lower portion of the chart. And you can see that there are some outliers at or near the middle of the chart. So yeah, we are talking about bias, but again, we want to call your attention to the middle of the chart. There are a concentration of articles here that do fall into the low reliability. There are low reliability content publishers that are way out to the left and way out to the right, but they also exist in the middle. But the emotional language, the political focus, the focus on a political audience in these regions here, the left and the right, these are the areas that drive the polarization. This is where the polarization occurs in media. So this is the content that excels in confirmation bias. So if you tend to lean to the left and you consume all this information, it's just going to be, yeah, that's what I thought. And everybody here agrees with me. And if you tend to lean to the right, if you only consume this information that's on this side of the chart, then yeah, you're going to get a lot of opinions that you already think of, and it's just going to be, yeah, that's what I thought. And guess what? All of these people agree with me, so it must be true. It just confirms all of the bad stuff that people who are in these two different camps, it confirms all the bad stuff that they already believe about the other side. It does tend to foster this us versus them mentality. And it becomes very clear when we do get down into the language use, how it does feed into that us versus them mentality. And so this is why whenever there is a conversation about political bias, accusations of the other side that, spreads information, that's when it takes over, because this side is claiming the other side spreads misinformation, and this side is claiming the other side spreads misinformation. So this is really the political bias at the extreme. But in reality, if we want to talk about misinformation, we have to be willing to realize that, yes, it does exist on the right. Yes, it does exist on the left. And yes, it does exist in the middle. So we can't automatically make assumptions about the text we're reading. We really do have to dive into it and look for the markers of the misinformation, regardless of what side we think it's falling on. We have to remember to mitigate our own bias in order, keep that open mind in order to be able to look at this effectively. So sometimes the inaccuracy, it's due to lazy reporting. It's just something that is being regurgitated over and over again, no matter how selective it is, no matter the propaganda that's being used. But although that we can see, from our data, though, that the correlation here, that's why, again, this is what's driving the polarization. So this is what gets all of the attention, and the middle tends to be ignored when we have conversations about bias in the media. So let's look at a couple of examples here. You can see that Joe Rogan's podcast is pretty far down on the reliability scale, but it's in the middle. And there are other examples like, the National Enquirer, it might lean a little bit to the right. And this is, I believe, I'm going to have to bring this up. I can't remember. I think this is Russell Brand, his podcast that's right here. Pretty much in the middle, but slightly just left of center, but still pretty balanced. Yet identified as unreliable. So I've asked Beth if she would, because she is our media research specialist, if she would just go into a few moments of explaining the Joe Rogan podcast, or the National Enquirer, and how is it that, we arrive at these scores. Beth, would you like me to bring them up on the interactive chart while you talk about them?
Yeah, that wouldn't hurt.
Okay.
So most of us are, I'm sure, familiar with the National Enquirer, and most of us are probably also familiar with Joe Rogan's podcast. As Jen just said, they are both near the bottom of our chart and near the middle of our chart, near the center. But they're kind of in the center for two different reasons. So it explains a little bit about how sources might end up in the center of the chart. National Enquirer, for example, I can remember as a child in the grocery store, the National Enquirer might have a story on the cover, something like, "Woman has alien baby," or something like that. These days, over time, it got to be more about celebrity gossip and celebrity news and things like that. But most of it was unverified, couldn't be corroborated, those kinds of things, but it's not political. Woman having alien baby is not a political position. So our analysts don't detect bias in those types of stories, or a celebrity news story, celebrity gossip. Most of the time, those don't have bias, but it's definitely still unreliable. So that's why National Enquirer consistently tends to be at the bottom of our chart. Looks like contains misleading info is the category that it falls within on the reliability scale. Now, Joe Rogan's podcast is also in the middle of the chart and down low, but it's for a different reason. If you see the individual dots on the chart, those represent individual articles from the National Enquirer or episodes of the Joe Rogan podcast that our analysts have rated, again, in their pods, each of which containing a left lean, a right lean, and a center. If you go to our interactive chart, you can actually click on those little green dots to see what article and podcast episode we rated and what scores they got. In Joe Rogan's case, it's not that his podcast episodes were unbiased, it's that the bias was all over the place. So if you haven't listened to Joe's podcast, he tends to bring on a guest for a lengthy interview. And the guest can be somebody from the far left politically, from the far right politically. and they have a conversation. So in the end, we detected bias on both sides. Some of his episodes had a strong left bias. Some of his episodes have a strong right bias. But in almost all of those cases, we found it to be unreliable information because, in our opinion, what Joe Rogan is doing is not really journalism. He's interviewing people and letting them talk about what their views are. He's not fact-checking information. He's not asking follow-up questions to be sure that the information is correct. Journalism standards, as Jen talked about a lot last time, who, what, when, where, how. That's the job of journalists, to check out the information from the people that they're interviewing to make sure it's correct, to make sure it's true, to make sure it's factual. And this is more just a conversation where Joe Rogan doesn't go into that extra step as far as journalism accountability. So Joe Rogan's podcast tends to be, again, down at the bottom, kind of overlapping between contains misleading info or selective or incomplete stories, unfair persuasion or propaganda, somewhere in that category. But it's in the middle because the podcast episodes are kind of all over the place in terms of bias. So we've heard a lot. We have heard a lot as a company from people who follow our chart over the years who have said, what? Didn't you see that episode where Joe Rogan interviewed so-and-so? That was so liberal. And then the next person will say, what? Didn't you see that episode when Joe interviewed so-and-so? That was so conservative. And they're both right. But tomorrow's episode could be something completely different. So he lands in the middle. A lot of people have questioned us about it because of specific episodes that they have seen or heard or listened to. But overall, when we average all of our ratings together, it puts him in the low middle.
Thank you, Beth. And I think another thing that is good to point out, now that we have this up on the interactive bias chart, like Beth pointed out, each one of these little dots represents either a different episode from the podcast or it represents a different article, from the Inquirer. One thing that we have to be very careful about is if we are rating a particular source, while we can allow its placement on our chart to give us a hint of where we might think this article or this podcast episode is going, we cannot just automatically make the overall assumption, though, because as you can see, Joe Rogan, while overall, because he does have several episodes that do fall below this 24 line, making it unreliable, but he also has a lot of episodes that are pretty high up. I mean, there's one all the way up here in thorough fact reporting or fact dense analysis. So again, this is a fantastic discussion to have with your students. When you bring up a particular source in the interactive chart, you can look at what the individual dots, what are the episodes, and have that conversation on, yeah, this is the National Enquirer, and we know overall this contains a lot of misleading information. What's going on in some of these other articles that are pretty high up? And make that, a discussion in the classroom. So again, it's a way to just remind ourselves that we can't automatically make assumptions. That's why it's critically important to go through the methodology step by step to make sure that we are applying it consistently across the board. So that's what we wanted to show you there. Let's move on to the next examples. Let's look at higher up on the chart. So you can see, and we've talked about bias not necessarily being inherently bad. It's not inherently bad. There are plenty of examples of sources on our chart, as you can see here, that they are biased. We determined them to be either they skewed to the left, maybe they even skewed strongly to the left, or they skewed to the right or skewed strong right. We did determine them to be biased, but still they found a way to be reliable. They're in what we call the green zone right here. They're above this 40 line. They're in, that on that scale of 1 to 5, they're at a 1 or 2 in that overall scale. So this again just underscores the fact that you can support a biased argument, right? You've made a judgment, you've made a conclusion, but you're supporting that argument with logical reasoning. You have the facts and the data to back it up. You're using sound judgment to arrive at your conclusion. So when you take a look at what skews left and then what skews right, in these individual columns here, strong left, strong right, these are still showing as more reliable. And these are much different from left-leaning and right-leaning examples that we looked at on the previous chart, where you could see at the lower ends, that's what drives the partisanship, in the media. It's because of those low reliability scores and the extreme viewpoints that are apparent, in those sources. But these examples, regardless of the bias that do exist, they don't drag the quality of the content down by using things like logical fallacies, or they don't use language that will dehumanize, their opponent, or they try to paint their opponent as a villain. Anyone who represents the other side must be evil. So these right here in this part of the chart, they do tend to be the more factful type of pieces of content. Sometimes topic selection might be what pulls it to the left or the right. And we'll show some examples of that later on. Maybe there are conclusions or judgments that are being made that support a left-leaning point of view over a right-leaning point of view. But again, these are supported by logic and sound judgment. So again, this would be a good practice to bring up, in the classroom and have that conversation. These are examples that, no, just because there's bias, that doesn't mean that they are inherently bad or that they are inherently unreliable. So how do we actually arrive at how we're rating bias? It really is in the language. So 3 of the elements that I want to really take you through, we have the political position, terminology that's used, and then we have how opponents are categorized. And then, we look at the comparison across the board. I had mentioned the importance of lateral reading last week. So these are the 3 elements that I want to take you through. So this is the actual methodology that we use as analysts when we're rating each and every single article that we look at. So let's start with political position terminology. And what this does, this terminology, it basically refers to the policy positions and the actions of current elected officials in the United States. So this is something else that's really important to underscore, that when we talk about bias, we're looking at this from a United States cultural point of view. That's really important to remember, because if you begin reading articles from other sources, from other countries, their culture may have an impact, and it might skew how their bias would be rated. So I think for the purposes of your classrooms, I would encourage you to use sources that are within the United States, so that you can have this type of a conversation that, when we're talking about political positions, we're talking about our current elected officials that are in the United States. And so it's important policy position is what we're talking about right now. It's not just what an elected position official might believe about something, what they might tweet about something, but if we're looking at the political positioning. So we look for several clues in the text when we're trying to determine the political positioning. So for example, the terminology that's used in the text and how that language is being used to either self-label or label their opponent. For example, when we pay close attention to the words being used in a text that is about the topic of abortion, there is a difference between labels like pro-life versus pro-choice versus pro-abortion versus anti-abortion. Each one of those words represent a very different idea. And depending on who you're talking to, whether they're self-labeling or they're labeling their opponent, you can get a good idea of where the bias is in that political terminology. That gives us a pretty good indication of that. And one good way to keep up with the political terminology is paying attention to the elected officials and how they carefully select their words. So you really do have to be in tune with what's going on in today's politics. So remember last week, I had mentioned, no, your students aren't going to become political experts, but by doing these exercises, they do become more aware of what's going on. And so this is a fantastic exercise to be able to increase, their understanding of political positioning. So if you pay attention to the policy positions of current median Democrats or current median Republicans, sometimes those on the outskirts of those, the more extreme areas of the far right or the far right or the far left, they will sometimes refer to the current median Democrats or Republicans as the establishment. So that would be a clue that you could look for in the text. So listen to how they describe themselves, or as you're reading the text, pay attention to how they describe themselves and their opponents. And that's going to give you a clue as to how strong the bias is to the right or to the left. A progressive will label themselves as progressive. We read a lot of sources that are self-labeled as progressive, a lot of writers who self-label as progressive, but somebody on the right might label them as a snowflake. So there you can see the difference in the bias and how the terms are being used. Republicans who were in Trump's camp, or maybe they're still in Trump's camp, they might label themselves as true patriots. You'll hear that word, those words, that self-labeling used a lot, but their opponents who are on the other side would label them as deplorables. So you can see, if you pay attention to the language, it's really going to make the bias apparent throughout the data. So our data, as we're collecting all of these sources, it does show that those that are in the most extreme political positioning, they'll use words like socialists or nationalists to self-label, while they'll label their opponents as racist Nazis or as communists. So again, just being mindful of the labels there. It's important to note that those who are within the political sphere, they do specialize in making their opponents seem like a boogeyman. And so if you look up the word boogeyman in any dictionary, it's basically somebody who is evil, somebody who has, ill intent. And so you'll notice, especially in the extremes, they'll want to paint their opponent as the boogeyman, especially if they're a high profile candidate, if they're a high profile politician. They're the ones that will be painted the boogeyman over and over again. They convince their camps, their own camps, that the other side, this person that's representing the other side, is completely evil. They're an evil component, and they're out there. They are bound and determined to destroy our way of life. So these are the things that are being used, the words that are being used, the language that's being used to describe the opponent. So that's one element of bias and what we look for using our methodology. We do have other elements that we look at when analyzing the text for bias, and that is opponent characterization. So let me break down what are we talking about when we're looking at opponent characterization. So it's especially helpful to pay close attention to the adjectives that are being used in this sense, especially adjectives that are being used to describe political opponents. The less adjectives that are used, the more straightforward the language, the less bias there tends to be. If there are descriptive adjectives or they're pretty neutral, in terms of their descriptions, that's a more neutral opponent characterization. And that's not necessarily, leaning far to the left or to the right either way. Those will tend to keep bias toward the middle of the chart, at least close to the center. It might be a little left of center, a little right of center, but it's still pretty close. The more suggestive adjectives that you might come across, like if someone is calling their political opponent cunning, or they're describing how their political opponent is a whiner, something like that. It's a suggestive adjective. It's not terrible by any sense, but it does give an inclination, of a bias, whether it's to the left or to the right. Now, if there are stronger words, stronger language being used, there's more insulting language that's being used, like they're calling an opponent lazy, or they're calling them vindictive, or they're calling them a wretched liar, something like that. That's going to pull it out even further to the left or to the right, because it's making it clear. Again, it's feeding into that us versus them mentality. And these do tend to be more in the hyper-partisan, type of articles that we look at. So again, we do see in the chart that there is a correlation with the more extreme the insult, the more likely you're going to see adjectives like stupid, or they'll use logical fallacies to try to prove a point. They'll use ad hominems, or they try to paint the person as a villain, so there's vilification there, or they try to dehumanize them with the language that they use. Name calling, some of my personal favorites that I've seen is when one side is calling Republicans Republicans. That was a pretty fun one, a funny one I've seen. And then on the other side, I've seen Republicans calling Democrats demon rats. So that's a pretty, far right or far left. That's pretty insulting language. That's going to be hyper-partisan. So again, the clues are there if you pay attention to how the language and the adjectives that are being used to describe the opponent. So I'm going to go back to looking at the chart. And again, we're going to go back to the bottom left and the bottom right, because there are some very good examples to look at in regards to the hyper-partisan and the extreme bias that exists in these. And I'm going to ask Erin to take us through some of the examples that are probably her favorite examples when we talk about hyper-partisanship and looking at the opponent characterization and the language that's used. Uh-oh, Erin, are you there? Are you muted?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Oh, you just want me to start and list with the ones I wanted to talk about?
Yeah. What do you want to bring up?
Okay. So a very special special one is what I'm going to call it, is the Wonquette on the left, the lower left. This one has what can only be described as hyperbole, very vicious headlines. It character assassination type of articles that are just meant to go after individuals. And this is something that we usually get a lot of feedback from as well. People saying things like, but they show the receipts, that they know what they're talking about. And I'm like, okay, but then if you look at the language that they're using, it's a lot of insults, a lot of inappropriate language, nothing you would want to show your children, definitely not anyone in the classroom. I'll let you look at that on your own time. I don't think we want to share this on a Zoom call. So that would be one on the lower left. And then on the lower right would be anything by natural news, climate news. This is a whole network, actually, of websites that are on the lower right. And it's, climatenews.com. You can look at them. And they all look very similar to each other. They're just like replicas of the same website over and over again. And they sound exactly like what they are. Natural news is a lot of home remedies. Climate news is a lot of news about the climate. But it's a lot of far-fetched conspiracies talking about this news report was released. What aren't they telling us? I'm just asking questions, that type of language. And what is interesting about this website is that they will filter in some real news reports from other very reputable sources, and it will link out to other websites. And if you're not familiar with this website or the type of reporting that they do, it's easy to kind of fall into the trap. And this is where teaching your students lateral reading, these websites would be a great resource for that. Because it teaches them to check the citations, check what does this sentence mean? What are they trying to get at? Is it giving you answers or is it asking questions? And news should be giving you answers, not questions. So I would recommend those for maybe an exercise in your class. So that's a favorite of mine.
Thank you, Erin. And we could bring up examples all day. So that's why we encourage you, get into the interactive media bias chart and just start looking around at these different sources. And Erin's right. Make sure that you look at them ahead of time before you bring them into the classroom, just to make sure that they're age appropriate, because there are some sources in here, some articles in here that are just really out there, and you don't want to subject your students to that. So so far the lower left, lower right regions, go in there and look around at those particular content pieces that we have in there. Erin had mentioned the lateral reading, and so one way to be able to discern bias, the lateral reading is important because that's going to help inform your comparison. So when you're looking across different sources that are across the political spectrum, you'll get a pretty good indication of how different topics are covered, what is typically covered, the language that is used, the talking points that are used. So it's really important to do that lateral reading. And sometimes when you're doing the comparing, so when you're comparing one thing to another, you're able to see where the blind spots are on both sides, because again, depending on the topic, there might be something that the left isn't covering, but the right is, and vice versa. There might be a topic that the right leaning sources are covering, but the left leaning sources are not covering them at all. So when we're looking at comparison, there are actually three elements that we pay close attention to when using comparison as a factor. And so, of course, your own background knowledge, and we'll look at the factor of omission and then the factor of topic selection. So these are the three elements to break down comparison. So questions that we ask ourselves when, we're trying to compare based on either what we know or what we have read somewhere else. Is there a more neutral way to say this? If you've read some of the more higher reliable sources, you can get a pretty good indication of the differences, when you compare the more reliable sources to the more unreliable sources, and how the adjectives that are being used to describe whatever the topic is that they're talking about. So is there a more neutral way to say this, or is there a more extreme way to say this? Is there a more extreme version of this? So again, that lateral reading is a great way to get an indication of that. So the more articles that you can read, the more familiar you become with the different topics and how they're being covered across the political spectrum, the more precise you can get with using the methodology. And it's really something that will help your students practice and develop an important skill, in discerning the bias, and doing that lateral reading that really helps with the reading comprehension as well. So that's the comparison. We also look at omission. So this one will also affect reliability as well. Because if you're looking at a source and if it's a fact that is germane to the understanding of the story, it's really something, it's a critical point that's being made. And if you leave that point out, it completely changes the understanding of the story. So if it changes your understanding of what is happening by omission, that's misleading, to the reader. So that's going to knock it down. And again, this happens in the more extreme, examples, more extreme bias examples. So that's another reason why they do tend to get more low reliability scores, because when you look at those extreme, the lower left and the lower right regions, there's some really good examples of omission in there. So look at what is the information being provided, and what is important in these fact-based stories. Again, go back to the lateral reading. How is it being covered by these more reliable sources? What are the facts that are being covered? Is there anything that is critical to our understanding of what's going on that is going to impact the reader's understanding of that in a negative way or in a positive way? Sometimes leaving something out is, it's in favor of the opponent. So you have to ask yourself the question is this an acceptable omission or is this an unacceptable omission? Truly, does this really change or impact how we understand the article? And then the third thing that we look at, for the rating using comparison is, of course, the topic selection itself. Now, we have a really good relationship with Ground News. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they do a really good job they'll look at our chart and they're looking at what are the news of the day, what are the topics of the day, what's trending, and how are they being covered. They look at the headlines and how are they being covered, across the spectrum. And they do a really good job at showing examples of the blind spots that do exist where it concerns topic selection. So, and you can see right here, there were a few examples that I pulled from their Instagram page, a couple of examples that are blind spots for the left. In this headline, Biden authorizes military to use up to 3,000 reserve troops to augment U.S. forces in Europe. And they looked at 29 sources. And out of those 29 sources, a good vast majority covering this topic were right-leaning sources, and only like 14% of the sources out there covered this topic. So that's a blind spot for the left. And then another example, blind spot for the left, a third of student borrowers spent money they thought would be forgiven. And this was a poll that was shared. So again, looking at all of the different sources, a vast majority of the sources were covered by right-leaning media, and also center media. None that were left-leaning media covered this story. So that is absolutely a huge blind spot. But it happens on the right-leaning media as well. So a blind spot for the right in this headline: Black men at higher risk of death from melanoma, study finds. There was, out of the 17 sources that covered this, vast majority were left-leaning. Only like one of them came from a right-leaning source. So that's a blind spot. And then this fourth example: election officials sue conservative voting group over refusal to produce ballot harvesting evidence. So again, out of all of the sources, vast majority, like 72% of the sources that were covering this topic were left-leaning sources, and only about 11% that were covering it came from right-leaning sources. So again, this is where the lateral reading and learning how to use different sources to help us fill in the blanks. So is there a slightly more interest to one side over the other? Is the reporting on one side more than the other? Is it considered to be more important, a more important topic on one side versus the other? And also look at who do they choose to interview. Do they choose to interview really high profile politicians, or are they choosing to interview some more obscure figures that you're probably not going to know who they are, at the onset of reading or watching that interview? All of those go into determining, how topic selection goes into rating bias using comparison. So at this point, I do want to call your attention to a couple of websites that I brought up, because we've covered a lot. Again, drinking from the fire hose, covering the methodology on how we actually assess bias in rating the news. Some of the examples of the extreme examples that we found on the chart, just to give you an indication of bias on the right or the left, doesn't necessarily come from the opposite side. So this is where you have to be very careful in your reading. Let's look at a couple of examples. So this clearly not a very positive look for the president. And you can see the language that's being used. The rats are jumping ship. So very clearly, this is insulting. This is dehumanizing. And that right there is enough to knock the reliability down. And this is going to be an extreme viewpoint. And as you read through this article, it's very clear that this is coming from an extreme right-leaning point of view. But again, I wanted to show you these examples because it doesn't always mean, just because someone is being critical, let's say, of the president, it doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, this must be a far right-leaning source. So if we look at this example from leftvoice.org, the fight for socialism after a year of malarkey. And so reading through this article, there's this one section. This is exactly what the Democratic Party does. As mass movements emerge, they begin to question the Democrats and institutions of capitalism. Democrats and their proxies swoop in with big promises, and the leaders of unions and nonprofits mobilize to get out the vote for the Democrats. Once they're in office, the party feigns incompetence, so some people will believe they tried. And as you continue to read on, you begin to understand that this is coming from a democratic socialist point of view. So this is more of a hyper-partisan to extreme left-leaning point of view. So this is basically the left critiquing the left. Remember earlier, I said sometimes they'll use words like, the establishment, when they're describing Democrats or Republicans. So if they're on the extremes, if they're describing him as a neoliberal, that's a pretty good indication that this is going to be a left on left critique of the president. So that's not going to go into a right-leaning bias because it's critiquing Biden and his policies. This is going to go into a far left-leaning bias because it's a far left critique of Biden's policy. So I just wanted to show you that example because I think a lot of times it's really easy to forget, or it's really easy to just assume if there is a critique, we automatically want to say that, oh, it's biased, so it has to go to the other side. And that's not necessarily the case. So with that, let me get back to what we are. Oh, and we are actually getting toward the end, which is a good thing because we had some Q&A from last time. There were some questions from last week, especially centered on accountability. There was a question about, do we re-rate articles? Do we look at articles again, if new information comes out? So we wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about accountability and where that's concerned. So I want to show you a couple of examples. I'm going to ask Erin to come back on and she's going to talk a little bit about our accountability process. And I'll bring up our one of our most recent blogs that talks about some changes that happened in CBS and Daily Mail due to accountability. So Erin, let me bring that up.
Okay.
All right. Look at all this awesome news, y'all. So if you haven't read our blog, start reading it. I'm pretty excited about it.
Back up.
Okay, did I pass it?
Mm-hmm. It's the July web chart.
Oh,
there it is.
I went way past it.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go.
Yeah, just to refresh those, if you weren't here last time, the question was someone had asked if we ever go back and rate sources when we find out that something that had already been printed or posted was incorrect. And the answer is yes, we do. And as you'll notice in bold there, it says article accountability. That's our internal name for it. Basically, it's that when we find out something is incorrect, we go back and we rate the original article and the corrected article if it has been corrected. And in the case of this blog post, it's pretty short, shouldn't take you longer than a couple minutes to read, and includes a new July web chart in it, so check that out. Just goes over that we had 2 sources move, which is a pretty big deal considering it was CBS and Daily Mail. They're very popular sources, so we have large sample sizes for them. In the case of CBS, it was because we had to do 2 different article accountabilities for them. And they were rated very, very low. One for CBS was because of 4 inaccurate statements in one article. So it was rated 7. And these are relatively arbitrary numbers. They're just in the rankings. When you look on the chart, you'll see where they fall within the category. So you don't really need to know what each number means, but you'll see where they fall when you look at the chart, which we can go over. But basically what it means is that CBS dropped a couple points. And in an overall sample size, it's kind of a big deal to see that kind of movement given how big of a source that they are. However, it didn't change where they are placed within the chart. They are still in their same category that they were before. And the same is true for Daily Mail, which actually has a much larger sample size than CBS, and they dropped 1.5 points. So this is just a short little write-up of that process. Links to both sources CBS links to the article that we rated and goes over it. So I just wanted to circle back from the previous session so you can check this out and look at it if you would like to.
Thank you, Erin. So that was a good question about accountability. All right, so we're at 10 after the hour. That leaves us with about 20 minutes left to answer any questions that anybody has. I see that I think there's some chatter in the chat, and it looks like there's some Q&A.
The first question is related to what Erin was just talking about, so this might be a good time to take that one. A participant says that she doesn't understand the numbering on the left, like the number 25, number 24 that you mentioned. If you can pull back up the chart, maybe just explain a little bit the numbers on the reliability scale.
Yeah, actually, if you could go to the interactive chart, because our second question is about how we differentiate between TV and web. So maybe go through like the filters as well.
Okay. Here we go. Okay, so the numbers, like Erin was saying, they're probably not going to mean a whole lot to you as far as last week when I talked about on a scale from 1 to 5, and we broke down the different elements of reliability. When you look at how that scale from 1 to 5 will fit into the chart, if something is rated at a 1, in terms of reliability, that's going to pretty much put you in the higher region, higher reliability score. So that's going to be anywhere from, 48 all the way up to 64. We know that, that those are pretty good investigative pieces, or it's, really high effort in reporting. It's fact dense. There's very little to no analysis that's in there. And then if you go down to that scale of 2, when you put it all together on our chart, when you transfer it over to the chart, that's going to put you more in this mix of fact reporting and analysis area. So typically above 40. And what that means is, yeah, there is some fact reporting in there, but there also is a good amount of analysis. So they're taking the information and they're drawing a conclusion about that information. That doesn't mean that it's unreliable. It just means that it's not pure news reporting. There's more analysis. So again, from last week, remember one of the things we talked about was veracity. So what's the probability that this is true? What's the likelihood that this is true versus the likelihood that this is false? And then as you move down that scale in, the region number 3 is something debatable. Are there a bunch of opinions in there? There's a wide variation in reliability because of the opinions. Typically, that's going to fall within this area between 24 and 40 range. The less facts there are to support the opinions or the conclusions that are being made, the lower the reliability. If it's all conclusion and, it's all statements as if they're facts, they're just a bunch of claims, but there's nothing to back up those claims, then that is pretty much in that 4 region. So going back through the reliability scales, the elements that we talked about last week. So that 4 region is going to be here. It's a wide, variety and reliability, opinion. There might be something problematic, like maybe there's a problematic headline in there, something like that. Now, when we get below the 24 line, below 16, where it has misleading, below 8, that means that there's something false in there. There's something inaccurate. Even if it's one statement, it's inaccurate. Then we label it as inaccurate and it falls below 8. All of this area is in that 5 region on that scale of 1 to 5. So for you, to get used to it, the more you use the chart, the more you'll be able to quickly discern, oh, this is above 40. That's like the green zone. So we know that these are pretty reliable. Oh, this is between 40 and 24. This is where a lot of opinions exist. And then, you'll eventually begin to realize, oh, this is below 24. This is something that there is something egregious. There's something problematic in terms of maybe it's misleading. Maybe there's something inaccurate, so that's really what the numbers mean. In terms of the chart itself. So I hope that helps. If you do decide to use the resources that we have, I showed you this last week, the content, the lessons that we have, how to rate expression, headlines, veracity. It has the bias guide, the simplified rating methodology, and then the blank media bias chart. The more you use these resources, again, the easier it is for you to very quickly be able to see in terms of reliability and bias, that scale that we have. So I hope that answered your question. Does that help at all, or did I completely make you even more confused?
I think that was an excellent explanation.
Okay.
I got a yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and it helps with the blank chart, because you got the orange, the red, the green. That's always a great place to start.
That's right. Yeah. So when earlier I'd mentioned the green zone, so you can see the way the chart is color coded here. That kind of helps you out as well.
Yeah. So the next one was, she had previously asked if we differentiated between web and TV sources like CNN and Fox. Mm-hmm. And so it'd be great if you could pull up Fox and CNN and show TV and web.
Absolutely. So when you look at the media bias chart, the interactive version, this is a little too big. I'm trying to make this a little smaller. You can see that you can actually filter websites, TV, and podcast over here. So if you only wanted to look at articles, you would be able to, what's happening? There is a delay in my computer. There we go. So you would be able to filter through these. And if you only want to look at the website articles, or if you only want to look at the podcasts, if you click on these, this will be able to give you the actual sources that fall, under that filter. And my computer is really slow right now. I think it has decided that it's doing too much at one time. So I apologize for that. Wanted to show you the options that you have for filtering. This, by the way, is the Education Pro version. And so if you use the Education Pro version, in addition to being able to filter website, TV, and podcasts, you're able to look at audience size, and then you're able to filter local news versus national news versus international news. You can search by ownership and keywords. So you had mentioned Fox. So if I just type in Fox, you can see all of the different Fox Corporation, Fox News, Fox Affiliate. So if I click on Fox Corporation, you can see that that's going to bring up all of the Fox sources under the Fox Corporation right here. Yeah. So you absolutely can. So you can see I got rid of the TV and video, getting rid of the podcast. And now this is just leaving me with the website articles. So I could look at those. And if I wanted to compare those with, CNN, I could
Yeah,
bring
you can
up,
see the different logos for the different ones: Fox Business, Fox 11, Fox
yeah,
35. So we have a team member who pulls the logos for each and every different source that we rate that goes on the chart. That's how we differentiate between everything.
yeah, yeah. So you can either look it up, according to affiliate or corporation, or you can just type in specific sources, like I'm doing right here. And then, you would be able to compare them that way. There's a lot of Fox in there. So if you wanted to pull up, the whole range of them, then I would recommend that you use the more options function. And again, go to the ownership. So that's Fox affiliate. So you can see a bunch of local Fox stations, and they're all pretty high. And they're, local news is usually really good. So,
Mhm.
all right. So that is the way you can use the interactive chart to dig down into the data. And again, all the different dots that you see are individual articles that exist. Does that help?
Yes. We've got another question. When one has limited reading time, is it better to read unbiased top sources or read factual biased articles on the top left and right?
That really would depend on what it is that you're, in what you're trying to teach for that day. If you really wanted to dive into language use, like the things that we talked about today, adjectives, so if you're an English teacher and you want to, talk about adjectives and how they are used to support certain bias on the left or the right, then I would suggest you pull articles that would be, easy to read articles. And again, remember, we have that topic of the week. So if you wanted, just to see what we did, then you could go to that topic of the week. And I thought I already had that pulled up. You could go to that topic of the week, and then that's what you could use to teach, the adjective part of it, and then have that conversation about left-leaning versus right-leaning bias, how the language impacts that. So, you could pull these articles if you have a class that, you think is age appropriate and they could handle the advanced articles, then you could come in here and choose any one of these. If you have, an age group that you don't think those topics are going to be appropriate for them, then you could always go to the starter topic of the week and then pull from those. So I would say it really just depends on what it is that you're trying to teach. If you want to focus on reliability, then I would focus on, here are different examples of different levels of reliability, but they're in the middle. So that keeps it easy, versus, left and right. And we're actually putting together one day. We're putting together a syllabus to be able to teach this in a 1-day format, or a what do we have, a 3-day or a 5-day format. So
1 day, 3 day, and 5 day.
That's right. That's right. So that could be something that you could integrate into your curriculum as well. Any other questions?
Don't see any being submitted. Oh, what came first? Media bias or political bias? Do media bias outlets align with some form of political bias? Oh, it's a chicken and egg question.
Yeah, it is, right? I mean, we recognize, I mean, of course, bias has always existed, right? I mean, there's just it, and as long as politics has existed, bias has existed. I mean, and that's why, earlier I was saying it's important to have a conversation that bias is not inherently bad. We need to have different points of view in order to have a full functioning society. We have to be able to have debates on topics of the day. Now, we do recognize, though, especially going back to the 2016 elections, which is why one of the reasons why Vanessa even created the media bias chart. Going back to that election, it was just very contentious, and with social media, people were sharing articles and information that just, they were not quality articles. They were not reliable, and so while people tend to focus more on the bias aspect of it, in my opinion, I think reliability is even more important, to focus on, especially when we're talking about media literacy or news literacy. So I think bias has always been here, but media has helped amplify it, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Final question. Well, not final question, but another one. Will you be addressing AI?
Oh, we could talk about AI a little bit next week. I don't know, real quickly. I don't know. Aaron, do you just want to take like a minute to talk about what we're doing with AI?
Just the short answer would be like, yes, we are going to be using our own AI modeling, but we will always include human analysts because there is no way to remove that element. They can't catch everything that humans can catch, like hyperbole and sarcasm and nuance. So we will always be involved. Vanessa has a great blog post. If you want to refer back to the blog, it is long. Just fair warning, but it is worth the read. And there is a quick executive summary at the top if you just want to get the highlights.
Yeah. And if you're asking the question about AI written articles, then the answer to that is also yes. We are incorporating into the ratings, if there are some of those telltale signs that something was written by AI versus an actual human being, we're talking about how does that impact the overall reliability of that source.
Yep. Yeah, we have lots of different forms of ratings that we do, and AI is just one of them.
Yeah.
Oh, another one. I noticed that some news sources ratings have changed over time. Do you keep a record of how those changes have occurred? For example, can you show a graph of how Bloomberg's ratings have changed? It's something that we're working on. It's not really a high priority because despite what I think many people think, they don't change very much. They change a little, and it's not significant. But it is something that we will be doing on the back end. If there are significant changes, then it's something that we'll definitely share that kind of information.
Yeah. And as far as showing movement on the chart, that takes an incredible amount of coding.
Yeah.
Like just to get
Visually.
the chart to operate the way it is. Yeah. It takes a huge amount of coding, on the back end. So yeah, I know that's a conversation that we've been having about, showing things that, if they move. So we're not sure when it'll happen, but yeah, it's definitely a source of conversation.
It's more a common occurrence for an individual source, like a show or a podcast, to move than it is for like an overall source. So CNN itself, if we use that as an example, because that one's been brought up a lot given the ownership changes in the last several months, CNN itself won't have moved. Again, this has a lot to do with sample size and the number of shows underneath the umbrella that is CNN. Hasn't really moved. But like an individual show underneath the network that is CNN, sure, it's moved. And so, there's a lot of movement for shows, and there's lots of reasons that can go into why they may have moved. Yeah. So it's a bigger question than just, did it move because this person bought the company or this because this person left the company. And we don't want to be making any kind of spurious conclusions, because that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to fight against here at the company.
Well, awesome. Very, very good questions. We are now at the hour. Thank you so much for attending the second session. I hope that you found this useful in talking about bias. Remember, next week, we're going to recap, bring everything together, implementing it into different classrooms, answer a lot of questions. So again, make sure you send us an email with any questions that we weren't able to get to tonight at info@adfontesmedia.com. And we'll also be sending out an email with, the recording of this, as well as some links to, be able to access some of the information here if you want. So yeah, that's it. Thanks again for joining us, everybody, and hope to see you next week. Y'all take care. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you, everyone.